Welcome, everybody. My name is Robert K. Elder. I am the president of the Chicago Headline Club, and we're about to kick off our leadership seminar, Managing Across Generations and Cultures. Our facilitator is Cadmona A. Hall. She's a Ph.D., and I'll let her sort of introduce herself and tell us a little bit about herself. And she is officially in the driver's seat. So welcome, Cadmona.
Thank you so much, Robert. I really appreciate you having me. I appreciate you reaching out, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight. I think that the Chicago Headline Club is an amazing organization, and I really appreciate the fact that you all value culture and diversity and value the opportunity to practice, these kinds of skills in a really meaningful way. So I appreciate you taking the time tonight. I'll just say a couple of little things about myself. I am a marriage and family therapist. And I currently train students at Adler University in our master's and doctoral program. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is social justice. And so in addition to a private practice, I have a grief and loss consulting company, and I also do diversity trainings. And social justice and dimensions of culture are sort of part of my wheelhouse and part of what I believe are really important in life, not just in work. And so I'm really excited to be here. I'm hoping that I can share some things that will be helpful for you all. And I'm also hoping that we'll have a good opportunity for some rich discussion and conversation. So please, you're welcome to, pause at a couple of moments and ask a question. Although my hope is that we can kind of go through a little bit, and that towards the end, we'll have some time for conversation, practice, and questions. So I hope that sounds good for everyone.
Thank you so much. And a reminder, everybody, this is going to be recorded and shared. And I think we can reference it, and hopefully it's something we can do every year. So I will now slip back behind the curtain, and Cadmona, thank you again.
Thank you. So my goal and thought for our conversation today is that we would have a little bit of time to talk about, values, beliefs, biases, things that impact the ways in which we think about dimensions of culture and our ability to really reach out, to learn, to connect with other folks. And in particular, because your work as journalists is so important, it's so critical to really, your tagline, protecting the public's right to know, right? And how can we do that from an informed position? How can we continue to push the envelope while providing the public with information that is meaningful? And how can you do that while also recognizing the ways in which power and privilege impact our lives on a daily basis? And so my hope is that we'll talk a little bit about some of those basic principles, and then some specific strategies for negotiating some of those difficult dialogues that happen, moving them over into courageous conversations. And in particular, what I'm hoping that you all receive by the time we're done is, what does it look like to repair ruptures when we make mistakes? I don't think any of us have ever had the experience, I don't think anyone has had the experience of making a mistake, saying the wrong thing, missing a step, and not wanting to fix it. And sometimes we just don't have the tools to make it happen. So my hope is today that you'll pull a little bit of that, from our conversation. So I want to just start with some principles of self-examination. I think that this is pretty congruent with the ways in which journalists are trained. I understand that one of the methods is a process around fault lines and really recognizing and identifying your own dimensions of culture, seeing whose voices are heard, whose are ignored and absent from conversations, and then really trying to be deliberate about how you can highlight and acknowledge folks that are marginalized and experiences that are marginalized. And so in this process, I think that valuing transparency is really key, right? Letting people know that we are human, really trying to sort of drop down some of the pretense and barriers that get in the way of human and heart-to-heart connection, right? Being fully present and authentic, recognizing and communicating our own thoughts, our own feelings, our reactions, and self-awareness, right? This process of self-examination, recognizing values, beliefs, assumptions, so that we can actually be congruent in the message that we're sending, right? That how you think, what you feel, what you say, and what you do are actually all in line. and that you are presenting the image that you're looking for. And so I think that, you know, you are the tool that you use in this process, right? That a journalist is only as good as as their own understanding of themselves and their subjects. And so I hope that you all have engaged in a process of self-examination, and that it's been something that's been, you know, hopefully meaningful to you. I wonder about the ways in which we can talk a little bit about recognizing where our beliefs come from. You know, what shaped them, and how have your own personal dimensions of culture really defined the ways in which you see the world, define the ways in which you know, walk through the world, and define the ways in which you look at stories and people's experiences. And so as we're thinking a little bit about this, you know, how I make sense of cultural competence and cultural awareness is nuanced. There's two parts to it that I think are really important. And it's, you know, cultural awareness is our ability to recognize that culture exists and that it shapes reality. And the fact of the matter is that it shapes reality in ways that are actually inequitable and unjust. And I think too often we may focus on what we wish it was, how things should be, as opposed to acknowledging what they actually are. But I think our ability to move into a position of recognizing in a sensitive way, you know, cultural sensitivity, and our ability to understand the existence of dimensions of culture, how they shape reality, and translate that into action is really key, right? And so when we're coming from a culturally competent position, when we're thinking about social justice in action, then we're actively challenging attitudes. We're actively challenging behaviors and conditions that create and reinforce injustice. And I think one of the key pieces to that is our ability to anticipate the impact of our actions on other people, and then being able to adjust and accommodate appropriately and accordingly. And so sometimes that can be a tricky piece. You know, what's the expectation for the ways in which I'm supposed to be able to anticipate, you know, someone else's response? And I think that this is one of the places where, you know, people can get tripped up into, is this supposed to be something about being politically correct and, you know, creating safe spaces that don't actually exist in real life, right? And so I'm pushing us to continue to grow beyond those kinds of reactivity places, because we do know that there are certain things that are unhelpful and there are certain things that are unjust, right? And so whether we're talking about the dimension of culture of race, if we're talking about gender, how can we be informed about the nuances that are missing from the conversation? How do we say, wait a minute, for a long time, gender's been so confining and so limiting. How do we broaden some of the definitions that are present? And how do we pay attention to, for example, our use of language, and whether that's something that's welcoming and inclusive, or something that really narrows things down and limits people's ability to be seen, to be heard, to be appreciated, and to be understood, right? And so if we're going to do that, if we're going to be able to understand where to enter into a conversation and do it from a position where we're being mindful of our own values and beliefs, then I think we've got to take some time to identify who we are and where we sit.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Cadmona.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Would you please, when you're chatting, when you're talking, can you show your face? And then when you're referencing slides, can we go to your slides?
Are we not, can you not see my face?
Mm-hmm. Everybody raise your hand if you can see her face. She's just a strip on the side. Okay, you can? My background is just your slides, and we have somebody saying she may be changing slides, but it's not showing up. So are you on one slide?
I'm stuck on the title slide. I don't know if that's where you are or if you've moved past that.
Yeah, Jonah, I'm the same.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. I wonder what we can do.
This has happened to me before. You may just have to stop sharing your screen and start again, and that might help.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, let me see.
And Michael, did you have your hand up for something? Did you want to say something? You're on mute, Michael.
Sorry about that.
It would help if you made her a co-host as well.
I am not entirely sure how to do that.
So I think you can pin the speaker view, Robert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've given her permissions. Oh, there you go. All right, how are we doing?
I apologize. I hope that we can.
I think we're good. Just let's just keep going.
All righty. Let me just fix this display setting real quick so that it displays properly. And then, okay. Well, I appreciate you letting me know. I want you all to see and hear everything that's going on. So great.
Yeah, and now we can see the different slides. That's great. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks. And so I think where I was leaving off was, how are you paying attention to your own dimensions of culture and the ways in which they bump up and are impacted by the dimensions of culture of others? And so this quick little chart is one that kind of highlights some of our main and salient identity points, but I recognize that it's not all inclusive, that it's not perfect, that it doesn't include every single piece here, but I thought it's a good starting place for the conversation. And so, have you all taken some time to think about where you sit in terms of each dimension of culture? How do you identify in terms of spirituality? How do you identify in terms of sexual identity and your own awareness of the process? Where do you sit in terms of class, ethnicity, age, gender, disability, race? And as I said, I recognize that it's not, fully inclusive of every single piece. For example, nationality or, language isn't here. Things like that, but I do think that this is a nice starting place to begin to dissect, where we are and again, how those things bump against. And so my hope in today's conversation is that we enter it from this position of age. As I was thinking a little bit about what might be helpful to you all and where we kind of are, I thought age is a good position, but it's also one of the conversations that we don't spend a lot of time sitting with, right? That we don't take as much time to think about some of the different generational cohorts that are present. And I thought that might be a fun opportunity. Let me see if I can move this over. And so we talk a little bit and think a little bit about the impact. Can you all see this, me moving around your faces? Okay, I want to make sure that I'm not blocking. I want to make sure that I don't block the view. Or the words from the screen. In general, generational cohorts are defined as an indefinable group that shares birth years, age, location, and significant life events at critical developmental stages. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this process is, just like with other dimensions of culture, it's not perfect, right? That right now, if you look at the research, even as we think about, baby boomers, traditionalists, Gen X, Gen Y, millennials, there's still no set standard definition that says if you were born officially in these years, that magically puts you in a locked position. And I think just like around race, around ethnicity, that there's lots of dimensions of culture that we ascribe to, even though the definitions aren't perfect, right? But the fact of the matter is that they have a significant impact in terms of how we walk through life and our experience of ourselves and our experience of others. And so, of course, there's major differences within cohorts that really impact things. But in general, when we walk through this, we'll also recognize that there are some interesting things that do shape our identities around here. And so as you're thinking a little bit about, each of the generational cohorts, I thought I'd just focus in on 3. And I wonder if some of those facts will seem appropriate to the cohort that they're connected to, and if some of them will seem like, no, that applies to everyone. How can these be assumptions? And so the first one are baby boomers, right? And so in general, baby boomers are folks that were born between 1946 and 1964, right? And so when you think about some famous baby boomers, we've got, you know, President Bill Clinton, Meryl Streep, Samuel L. Jackson, Oprah, right? That these are folks that are part of that cohort. And some of the experiences that shape this cohort are the fact that, you know, they were profoundly impacted by the Vietnam War and the lack of services and supports that were present for veterans when they returned. They were integral into the civil rights era, and they were profoundly impacted by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and JFK. And so baby boomers were born during a time of economic expansion and as young adults challenged social norms, right? They really saw themselves as pushing things forward and being change makers. But oftentimes when I hear people talk about baby boomers today, I don't hear people talk about that. I don't hear people acknowledge the ways in which, you know, they push for change and push for social justice at that point in time, right? One of the other places where baby boomers are named and talked about is around their views around work and their views around how that's connected to life, right? And so in general, folks say that baby boomers are value work that is central and connected to their own identity, right? That they see themselves as committed, as disciplined, as loyal, as responsible, and as ambitious, right? And so in general, baby boomers are the folks that are like, you know, you make a commitment to a company, to a profession, and you stay there. You dig deep in and you commit, you rise up, and that's sort of the expectation that they also have for other cohort members, right? And for folks that are coming from other generations. And I'm not sure that that's always the case, right? But how do those values then impact the ways in which folks from that generation connect with other folks in their lives? If we think about, you know, the next generation, Generation X, which is folks born in 1965, right, to 1980, you know, these are folks like, you know, President Barack Obama, Jennifer Lopez, The Rock, I don't know, other famous folks that have this, that were born in this time period. But they're seen as being independent, autonomous, striving for balance. And part of this is because their values were shaped by the experiences of the first Iraq War, by President Bill Clinton's sex scandal, the invent and the, I don't know, the dramatic impact of reality TV, the 24-hour news cycle, and those kinds of significant changes that happened during that time period, right? And so what they say about Generation X is that they were born during a time of stressful economics, which is why independence and autonomy was stressed as hard as it is, right? That as young adults, they tended to have an extended adolescence, and they also had a tendency to boomerang back home. They say that Gen Xers value independent and autonomous work environments, right? And that they're really looking to find a healthy and helpful work-life balance. And so I wonder if that fits for any of you, if that's your own personal experience, and if that's the expectations that you have for others, you know, in part of your generation. And so what happens when people don't behave in the ways that we expect, in the ways in which we think that they should? And then the last one for today's conversation are the millennials, right? The folks who are born from 81 to 99. You know, the millennials are in the workforce in a smaller amount. And so it's been interesting as I was looking at some of the research, because they're just really starting to understand how millennials are showing up and what their expectations of work-life culture is. Right? Millennials include, you know, Issa Rae, Mark Zuckerberg, you know, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, right? And their values have been shaped by, you know, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the second Iraq War, and the election of, you know, our first Black president, Barack Obama. Millennials are described as being team-oriented, civic-minded, and sociable, and valuing inclusivity and diversity. And so one of the things that they talk about in terms of millennials is an expectation for telecommuting. And I think it's interesting because we've all found ourselves in that position because of the current context that we're in terms of the impact of COVID-19. And so there were some expectations that, well, millennials would adapt like this, whereas, baby boomers would have a harder time because technology is not natural. And yet that hasn't really been the case. Many people across multiple generations have found ways to adapt and do things that have been meaningful in their work-life balance. And so as I think a little bit about, where we're positioned in terms of age and generational cohort, then it leads us to wonder, well, how does this fit into social justice, right? Like, how old I am is how old I am, and there's nothing I can really do about that. But where do we sit in positions of privilege, and where do we sit in positions of marginalization, right? And I think that using age to talk a little bit about that might be helpful. And so I thought I would show you this matrix to understand oppression. And I pulled this from a book called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice. And in it, it talks about all social identity categories. It highlights privileged groups, what they call border groups, oppressed groups, and then it's connected to the ism that's associated with it. And this is not a perfect chart. I don't think there is one, but I thought it was interesting to take a look and see that, when we think about age and cohorts, that the privileged group, or whichever group are considered to be middle-aged adults at the time. And middle-aged adults have the biggest sort of power. They tend to have the most money behind them, and because of capitalism and their position in the workforce, they push their agendas in different ways. Whereas young adults are the border group, or a group that sometimes dips into the privileged category, sometimes dips into the oppressed category. But who's oppressed when it comes to age? Who experiences marginalization? It's elders, right? And young people whose voices don't tend to be seen, whose voices are ignored. And so I wonder how we could be really mindful of how our age and our cohort dynamic then impacts our ability to step into some of these difficult dialogues that are necessary, so that we can do them in ways where we're sitting in positions of curiosity, right? Curiosity, we're looking to understand and we're seeking to learn, as opposed to just speaking to make a point, speaking to debate, and speaking, and listening only to have a response, as opposed to actually engaging in a conversation. I hope that makes sense. And so when I think about us moving from, difficult dialogues into constructive conversations, one of the things I'm always curious about is, have we sat down and thought a bit about what's our goal for the conversation, right? What are we looking to achieve here? If we're wanting to understand ourselves and recognize, again, how power and privilege is impacting this conversation, can we clarify the goals and name them out loud, right? That we've got a goal to understand, a goal to express our thoughts and ideas and our feelings, and an invitation to be curious and to process. And so I think that recognizing the process, not just the content of the conversation, is really key. And when we do that, then we're paying attention to how the conversation is happening, right? Not just the words that are being said, right? What are some of the underlying dynamics that are present? What are some of the emotions that are showing up? But also, how are people managing and negotiating the space? Whose voice gets to be, who decides who to write? Who decides who gets to take up the most amount of space? What happens if you've never practiced negotiating space with different groups of people? When I teach classes, lots of times I'll have students complain and they'll say things like, so-and-so is not participating in the right ways. And I'm always asking, who decided what the right way of participation was? Well, if you don't want to take up the time, you want to use the time, I want to use the time. Yes, I want you to use the time too, but sometimes what needs to happen is for you to take a deep breath, step back. It might be that the other person is ready and willing, but that they don't jump in right away. That the organizing principles that impact their beliefs about conversations are guided by a different value set that says, take your time, slow down, make sure that what you're saying matches what you really believe, right? Whereas other folks are out loud processors and they're just sharing it all. And neither is right or wrong, but is there space to even name that the way the conversation is happening isn't a one size fits all? And to me, that's what leads into compassionate consideration, right? How is it that we're naming and acknowledging that we're coming into the conversation with good intentions and with sort of hopes to have a good dialogue, from a healthy and helpful position, right? And do we give room for folks to stumble and make mistakes and opportunities for correction? And so, whenever we're having these kinds of conversations, I think just a little bit of structure can be helpful in terms of what's my expectation if I sit in a privileged position around the dimensions of culture, and what's the expectation if I'm sitting in a marginalized position with any of these dimensions of culture. So often when we have these kinds of conversations, many of us understand the impact of intersectionality and that we're constantly navigating the multiple relationships that we have with ourselves, let alone with everyone else. But I think when it comes to difficult dialogue, one of the things that's hard is trying to always have an intersectional conversation, because we are a combination of privileged positions and we are a combination of oppressed positions. Which dimension of culture are you talking from in the moment? Which dimension of culture is most salient in this conversation, right? At this moment in time. If we can name those ahead of time and create space for it, then it also gives us an opportunity to figure out, how do I need to enter into this space? What are the things that I need to be mindful of? And so when we're sitting in a privileged position, I think one of the things for us to be mindful of are some of these habits that we can fall into. And so when we're sitting in the privileged position, particularly when it comes to age, right, I think we need to be mindful of the difference between intent and impact, right? Or intent and consequence. So often we're focused on what our intended message is, that we don't slow down and take time to look at and tend to the impact or the consequence of what we've said and what we've shared. And one of the things that I think is so important here isn't to discredit what the intention is, but to leave a room for the impact first. What is the order of operations here? And so if someone has said, ouch, you wounded me, what you said just didn't quite sit right, that when we're in the privileged position, when we're taking accountability and responsibility, our first reaction can't be one from a position of defending what I meant, defending of what I wanted, but really tending to, what was it that happened? Where were you wounded? Let me ask from a curious and compassionate place so I can understand what your experience was, right? That's the starting place. And that requires that we have thick skin, right? That might require that you hear something about yourself that you didn't expect. And can you take the hit, right? That it's okay to make a mistake if we can learn from it and if we care about whatever wound was created by the other. I also think when we're sitting in the privileged position, we need to be mindful of language that's designed to invalidate. I think that this happens all too often. And because the English language is not as nuanced as we would like it to be, right? Words are being invented all the time. The dictionary is constantly putting new things in there, words that didn't exist before. 20 years ago, people didn't throw around the word bling. Now people throw it around all the time to the point that it's corny and it's old and we're not even using it, right? But how can language undermine who decided that certain phrases were acceptable? How did we determine what would be official grammar versus what's considered to be slang? And how do we not just accommodate, but how do we honor people's right to identify themselves the way that they choose? How do we hold space for people's lived experiences, right? And I think when we're sitting in the privileged position, the other thing for us to be mindful of in the conversation are mistaken notions of equality. Oftentimes when we're sitting in privilege, we assume everyone else has access to the same things we do and want to have conversations there without acknowledging that's not the case. It's not easy to just jump into a conversation, right? That it might take someone time to warm up. And I think that when we're sitting in positions of marginalization, we also have work that we need to do when we're entering into the conversation. And one of the most important pieces when we're in a marginalized position is to resist internalized oppression, right? The ways in which we've been taught to believe the negative ideas, to believe the stereotypes that exist, right? This is part of that self-work that we do in order to shift that, in order to challenge ourselves, to recognize that, wait, this isn't actually the case. Am I behaving in a defensive way, or have I just acquiesced to these beliefs that aren't actually true? The other thing that I think we have to be careful of when we're talking about tasks of the marginalized is overcoming habitual behavior. And so habitual behavior in this space is connected to what have you learned to do in order to protect yourself and to stay safe when you're having conversations with folks who are more privileged and more powerful. And two of the big habits that folks often have is, one, I need to convince you that the experience I'm having from the marginalized position is a real experience and that it matters and that it deserves to be acknowledged. And oftentimes folks can spend a lot of time trying to change someone else's mind as opposed to speaking from their position and their own truth and their own experience. And that can be exhausting, and it oftentimes doesn't work. And so then folks have these debates back and forth without actually moving to positions of understanding. One of the other pieces of habitual behavior that exists is the desire to protect and to protect the people who are sitting in the privileged position by not speaking their truth, right? By sort of coddling and being afraid that if you speak up and if you name the experience that you'll be punished, right? And so lots of times people will, quiet their voice and move into a position that's called voicelessness, will agree with things that aren't actually true because they don't want to experience the backlash and the punishment from someone who's in a privileged position. And so it can show up in these kinds of conversations and in these kinds of dialogues in ways that look like, oh, wow, this person really agrees with me, when inside they're boiling, right? When inside they're enraged. And what I mean by enraged is that they're reacting to an injustice, not just that they're mad, right? And so as we're thinking a little bit about this, tasks of the privileged, tasks of the marginalized, right? And we're about to have these kinds of dialogues, when we think about where we sit in terms of our age cohorts, there are ways in which folks who are baby boomers have been in a privileged position, right? That they've lived longer, they've seen a lot of things, but because of that, they also have access to, they've been sitting in positions of power for a while, right? And so how can they be mindful of conversations that they might have with someone who is, a millennial, is younger, right? Who's coming in with all that fresh energy, but might not have the same access that they do, right? And so someone who's a millennial might feel like you're talking down to me. You're not acknowledging what I might bring to the table. You're not hearing my curiosity, and you're not engaging me as an equal. And so how might I need to sort of shift some of that to have a different kind of a conversation? I think when we look at other dimensions of culture, like class, for example, right? How does that show up and impact where we stand and where we sit when we're having these conversations that are, where we're entering the conversation from a perspective of age, right? Age in and of itself might not tell the full story, but where we sit in terms of class, where we sit in terms of other social locations that also then inform, am I taking on the task of the privileged in this conversation? Am I taking on the task of the marginalized? How do I negotiate that? Who is it that I'm talking with? And how can I accommodate, right? That when I'm thinking about, our earlier slide around that sensitivity, how do I anticipate what might be? That's one of the places where that anticipation and then the practice is really key. And so as I was saying a little bit earlier on, we do make mistakes, right? We do have moments where what I meant to say, how I meant to engage you, didn't come across. I said something that was offensive and it needs to be addressed. Thank God you pointed it out. Thank God you called me on it. And now I want to, repair the rupture. And so I think this dated example, it's called the VCR method, right? And so let's be clear, who's got a VCR at this point? I mean, maybe some of you do. I kind of still do too, a VCR DVD combo, but that's because I'm a Gen Xer. So the VCR method is validate, challenge, request. And I think it's one of the most helpful ways of entering into conversations, but also a really helpful way to repair conversations when there's been a rupture, right? And we know validation is really about acknowledging who someone is and acknowledging that they're important, that they matter. Being able to say, I hear what you said. Validation is not agreement, right? You never have to agree with what someone said in order to validate that they've talked and that they've had an impact. The second piece, I think, is important to recognize, which is the challenge. Too often people mistake challenge for confrontation. Challenge never means to confront. What it means is an invitation to question, an invitation to wonder about a perspective other than what you've had. And so, can you invite the person to consider? Could you then make a request that you think about whatever the new option is, whatever the new piece of information that's been presented, are you willing to consider this as a possibility? Are you willing to recognize the impact that this has had on me in this conversation and the impact that it has on others? Are you willing to continue to have a conversation so that we can move forward and address the rupture? Do you recognize that there's been a wound? And so when I think a little bit about the ways in which difficult dialogues then move into courageous conversations, I think that they require us to be vulnerable enough that we're willing to learn something significant, both about ourselves and other folks, right? It means that we recognize the humanity that's in all of us while honoring the different dimensions of culture in which we sit and how power and privilege then impacts, our abilities to be healthy, to our abilities to be helpful, and our abilities to have new understanding that perpetuates further conversations for change. And so my hope is that with our remaining time that we can practice having that kind of conversation right now. I'm hoping we can think a little bit about using age as an entry point into the dialogue, and we could share, what are some of the missteps that we've taken, and what could we do to correct it? What questions might you have of each other in the process, and that we could put some of this into good use. So I'm hoping that we can all unmute ourselves and then step into a space for dialogue. So I'm going to stop my screen share so I can see you all, and so that we can participate into a good conversation.
All right, everybody. So I think, first, can you hear me? Okay, great. So you can unmute yourselves. I've sort of opened it up a little bit. So if you have something to share, please do. And I will just go first. I will try first. And part of it is my age, but part of it is also my training, and that is adopting the pronoun they. I am still it's not that I have a hard time incorporating it. It's just that I have a hard time remembering, and also it's against our sort of like AP Associated Press training. So for years, they is a plural pronoun, and so one of my favorite comedians, Ron Funches, he says, "Hey, you update your iPhone. Why don't you update your language?" But it's one of those things that I am continually challenging myself because it's not how I was programmed or trained. But again, I think the goal is, we want to be respectful, but it is something that I try to keep top of mind.
Yeah, I appreciate that example, Robert. I think that that's a great one, but especially the analogy of updating your iPhone, because it's not just, do I have the new information, right? But how do I put it into practice? What does it look like now so that it becomes more fluid and it becomes easier and easier to do? Other thoughts, other feelings, other reactions?
That's a really good example. I have a family member who prefers that pronoun, and it was a really, my first thought was not about necessarily not using it, but it was almost like are you sure? Because in my mind, I was really afraid about the amount of criticism she was going to face, or they were going to face in the future, and it was really hard because I wanted to accept them as they were, but also I had a lot of fears for them, and that, so it, some of that comes to mind as well when thinking about pronouns and thinking about accepting people in all of their greatness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciated you catching yourself, because it's so easy for us to, you know, habitual behavior, right? What are the words that we practice the most? And so being able to also offer each other grace in the moment, and to say, no, I'm practicing, I'm willing to do things differently, I'm wanting to. And so if you see me stepping, making a mistake, say something to me, but also I'm going to catch myself. I have a responsibility to do so. Other thoughts, other examples?
This isn't so much an example, but I do think we talked about how this pandemic has sort of changed workplace habits and just the reality of how we go about our work. I do think I wonder if it'll be a great opportunity to reorder some of these power dynamics, and for just to delve into some gross generalizations. The older people are, maybe the less comfortable they are with anything from a Zoom meeting to more work flexibility. I'm 53. I manage people who range from in their 60s to their 20s in my workplace, and I've sensed over the last couple of months that some of those things that are people are automatically advantaged because they may be older or more experienced in the workplace and everything, that power dynamic is shifting somewhat, and giving it, like I said, sort of opening up a window where we can rethink how we interact, and whether working from home is, a lot of people in my workplace were reluctant to, even though it was okay, you had permission to work from home, it was still frowned upon, particularly by people of an older generation, at certain expectations. So anyway, I'm just curious if others think that this is maybe one of the silver linings of this pandemic.
I would say absolutely, right? I mean, even thinking about mothers in my workplace, and the requests for some, or in previous workplaces, some mothers to be able to go part-time or to work from home, right? Like now we're all working from home. We're all having meetings from our computers. Children are always in the background. And I mean, I hope this is something that we can really think about the future, right? Like reporters with disabilities, right? I mean, we don't really see a lot of reporters with disabilities or physical disabilities anyway in the workplace, and maybe this will open up the ability for that to happen.
I think that's an excellent point, right? Like, again, that piece on access and opportunity. In what ways has this situation made us pay attention to who's visible and who's present and who's absent, right? And what are the things that have been getting in the way of allowing folks to have more opportunities to participate? I'm wondering about things that might not have been present in your own lives, but things that you've witnessed, in others as you've done this work. As you've been trying to think about how power and privilege continues to organize our conversations and our dominant ideologies, what are some things that you've seen and been able to address?
So Cadmona, I'll come in here just a little bit. So one of our previous programs was on it was hooked around a documentary called Cooked, and it was about survival by zip code. And so it was mostly about the heat wave in Chicago in 1995 that killed over 200 people. Again, most of them poor, African American, and it was really interesting. And the director had said, if you look at that map and you look at the COVID map, they're the same map. Just, you know, it's a way that poverty impacts the, you know, during a public health crisis. And so it was really interesting, especially listening to the journalists that are talking about going into neighborhoods and how to do stories that are important but respectful, and how to you know, be ingrained in those communities. And that's part of, you know, we're really lucky in the city that we have you know, like Block Club and you know, a couple other sort of startups that are working to do that kind of work. But they are also looking to change the dynamic with the neighborhoods that they report on. And I think that is an amazing thing that is not underlined enough. And, you know, they have open newsrooms and that sort of stuff. And again, I know they have their own struggles and whatnot, but that sort of work is so admirable. You know, City Bureau does that as well. I'd be curious for anybody who has participated in those dialogues, if there's larger lessons, and that's not just because I see Sheila Solomon's name pop up, but anybody else.
I guess like I often think about how we, you know, how do newsrooms represent the communities that we cover, right? And like one of the things that Cadmona said in the beginning was about this idea of having, you know, we see the world through our own lenses. And if we are not exposed to other cultures, if we are not exposed to other people's lenses, then we don't really know what our blind spots are. And so I often think about, and it saddens me deeply that a lot of the newsrooms, not only in Chicago, but throughout the nation, do not represent the communities that we cover, right? I mean, if Chicago was to represent our communities, it would be a third of our newsrooms will be Black, a third of our newsrooms will be Hispanic, and a third of the newsroom will be white, and that's just not what it is, right? And especially when we look at leaderships in newsrooms, there tend to be white males in those positions of leaderships. And then when we think about, especially there has been a whole push to have more minority journalists join the ranks. So then you see, you talked a little bit about that in your presentation, this inequality of power, not only in positions of power, but also age as well, right? Like a lot of the leaders, a lot of the editors are white, are male, and a lot of the younger reporters tend to be female, because that's just the way the newsrooms are changing, and they also tend to be from communities of color. And that creates this really huge gap that needs to be bridged. And I think because some of us might not have extensive training in being able to communicate, it has been really difficult to bridge that gap industry-wide. And you have seen, especially recently, a lot of people of color taking buyouts and just leaving the industry altogether. And it really saddens me, because I think that there was a real opportunity to be able to bridge that gap. And I don't know how else we can, and this was part of the idea of having this conversation, is like, well, we don't have the tools, and talking amongst ourselves is not going to bring us any tools to make a difference. We need experts from outside to help us bridge those, the huge divide, and make us have a real look into our industry, and help us ensure that the newsrooms of the future really represent the communities accurately, but also that we treat ourselves better, right? Like if we don't know how to treat each other and we feel discriminated against in our workplaces, then how are we supposed to go out into the world and talk about the communities and the problems that the world is having if we don't really do that in-house? So if you have any thoughts about how we can do this better, anything from what books we should be reading to how do we have these conversations and make more people join us?
Sure. Well, I guess one of the first questions I have for you all, though, is, as journalists, do you believe that your field should be socially just?
What do you
And
mean
that's,
by that? I'm sorry. Could you just clarify?
I guess what I mean by that is, do you believe that you should challenge the normal structure that's been the structure that's been normalized, that, you know, white men should be the top of the chart? Do you think that, you know, if you have access to resources and wealth, you should be in charge? Do you believe that that there is an onus for you all as a field to push against some of what has become normalized? And to be more clear, part of the reason why I'm asking is because in the experience that I've had as an educator and a therapist, I've received pushback around the idea of trying to be neutral. But I think neutral means actually maintaining systems of privilege.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, and I think that's a particular problem among journalists who are taught as a profession to be neutral and not and unbiased, rather than to recognize our biases and, you know, fight against them and sort of push back on them. And so I think that is an industry-wide and a profession-wide problem. You know, in terms of, and I think it's part of the problem with diversity in the journalism industry is that sort of, exactly how you put it, like that neutrality actually just upholds the status quo, and that's problematic.
I think that we, as an industry, are able to provide ourselves excuses to stay and maintain these privileged situations that we're in, that are unfair and not equitable for marginalized communities to not only tell these stories, but to also provide these stories that journalists are sharing. We're journalists, but we're human first. So as far as I see it, I mean, I've been, you know, there's a number of journalists and reporters and editors in this call right now that I respect and that have, you know, are seasoned. But in the 10 years that I've been doing this work, maybe it's because I am a marginalized person that I can't forget that I am human first. And that part of being a journalist, yes, it includes objectivity, but you're working with people regardless. You are in a workspace. It's still a business. You're still interacting with coworkers. You're still interacting with other humans. So I think it's like we're trying to, as I think as the POC community in the journalism industry, we're trying to expose these excuses and these, I think, irrational and racist, quite frankly, reasonings of maintaining this type of environment where we're not seeing a lot of POCs as leaders in this industry, as leaders in the Chicago media market, and it's because we're not being seen as human. We're, you know, we're going back to this reasoning of, you know, as journalists, we're trained to do such and such, but as humans, what were you trained to do? You know, that's just something that I find over the years a little bit frustrating, in trying to understand why it is complicated for us to face the fact that we are not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and allowing ourselves to face that truth that we cannot uphold ourselves on a pedestal as journalists, especially when we weren't journalists when we were born, you know? So that's where my perspectives lie.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate hearing that. And it makes me, along the lines of my earlier question, it also makes me curious about whose objectivity are you all trained to have? Right? Like who defined what would be objective versus what wouldn't be? And is there room for you all as a field to continue to evolve around even how we're defining those kinds of things, right? You know, so even if we go back to your point earlier, Robert and Alejandra, when we were talking about, you know, the use of pronouns and they, right? And the ways in which technically it's not grammatically correct. Do you all have some power as a field to redefine those rules because the original rule is oppressive.
Mm-hmm. Also, the AP style book just updated it, so it's okay now.
So the rule so that is a victory. A rule got shifted and changed.
Yeah.
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 Are there others that are in need?
Yeah, and it's a constantly evolving thing as well. We are almost out of time. I'm happy to extend this for a little while longer. I also want to direct everybody to, if you haven't seen it, the SPGA has some resources around Robert C. Maynard's Faultlines, which is a really amazing resource. You should really check it out. It's one of the things SPGA does really well on their website. And they have a diversity toolbox, and it's not only ways to talk about it, but ways to take on self-examination. So I wanted to remind people about that as well.
Another good resource is by Diane Goodman. Her website is pretty amazing, and she's written some really great books around, you know, diversity and dimensions of culture, and really position how your position and how you can use your power in meaningful ways. And so she's got a website that has lots of drop-down boxes and lots of tools that you can take that I think not only are important for you all as human beings, but I think can really be applied to the work that you do, right? And I think is a nice balance with some of the Faultline pieces that I saw as well, where it invited you to think a little bit about who is the story for. If the person you're writing to is different, then if the person you're writing to isn't the same people you're writing about, what does that mean? How do you help? How do you hold those kinds of conversations? And so I appreciated those connections. I'm also appreciating the vulnerability as you all are talking about, you know, where the field has come and where the field needs to go in terms of this conversation and in terms of this process. I think you can't make change happen if we're not willing to recognize some of what has gone on. Does anyone have any thoughts? Any curiosities, any questions that you didn't name so far or that you're sitting on that if you don't say, you'll be really aggravated about?
Sorry, would you be able to share the website you just mentioned in the chat or afterwards through Robert? That'd be great, thank you.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Hall, I wanted to ask about just like accountability and learning in the workspace. Because again, you know, I hear you talking about, you know, the recognition of these issues that we're having in our industry. And you know, it's not anything towards you because, you know, you are not immersed in, you know, this industry. But as I've experienced it, and I think a number of journalists of color have experienced it, it's, you know, the conversation of recognition has been the repeated conversation, and it hasn't turned into action or action that's sustainable in progressing, you know, these flaws that we have as an industry as a whole. So, you know, what do you like? What's your perspective on, or your advice on how we can engage now as marginalized journalists and our white counterparts? How do we engage in the conversation of action in terms of like accountability and learning to unlearn, you know, some of the flaws that we have been trained, you know, to be experts in?
Great question. So I think there's two things that can happen. One, I think sometimes we need to separate into affinity groups in order to practice, right? And so, you know, we're talking about issues of gender. Sometimes we need to sort of separate out and say, you know, how do you identify? How is that impacting things? When we're talking about, you know, race, you know, journalists of color, white journalists, how can you come together in your separate groups to talk about your identity and how your identities are impacting the process in order to prepare to have the joint larger conversation? Sometimes we're not ready to do it right away. And so can you create the space in the room for it? Because then I think you can practice accountability and the ability to hold each other responsible and accountable as opposed to the marginalized folks holding privileged people accountable. It can't actually happen. It won't work. And so I think that's one way. I think one of the other things that can be really helpful is one, just reading and acknowledging things, but also taking a look and making a deliberate decision to create a change. So oftentimes organizations will say things like, we don't have enough X, Y, and Z. And so, for example, maybe we don't have enough folks with visible disabilities who are present in our organization. If we build space, they will come, without questioning whether or not the environment is a welcoming environment. Most of the time, the answer to that question is no, because if the environment was welcoming, the people would be there. And it's not enough to just change. It's not enough to just change the complexion if you don't address the power structure that's involved, right? And so earlier when you talked about having lots of folks, who are younger, lots of folks who are marginalized in the entry-level positions, that's also not helpful. Ideas don't come all the way to the top, and the ideas at the top don't come all the way to the bottom. How can you make some shifts happen at each space in the process? Identifying what have the barriers been, so that then you can figure out, okay, well, what do we need to do in order to knock them down? So that's sort of my quick and dirty response to that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And Cadmona, we have a comment in the chat. I don't know if you can see it. If not, I can read it for everybody.
Let me.
Here, I'll read it, and we'll just for speed. Excellent presentation, especially the slide on VCR. Could you give examples or phases for channeling?
Oh, okay. So I'm assuming, Lori, if I'm saying that right, that part of what you're asking about is what's the difference in that validate, challenge, request piece. And so when I'm thinking again about what does it mean to challenge someone, have you considered X, Y, and Z? What you just said, what just happened, I'm recognizing that there's a pro-racist ideology that's at play here. Have you thought about what that might look like? If you were to make this change, what's your thoughts about how the kind of impact that would have on other folks, right? But I think the first part in that is, the need to validate. I understand your perspective. I see where you're coming from, and then moving into the place around offering the challenge. Does that make sense? Because again, it's the invitational question. Can you think about something differently? Are you willing to sit in someone else's shoes for a minute? Are you willing to consider a new way of thinking? And so I see you popped up and said, can you respectfully have that challenge? And I think some of what this is all about is, even how we define what's respectful. Because if you are in a structure that's very hierarchical, then just asking the question could be perceived as inappropriate and disrespectful. And that's the place where, when we're thinking about accountability and we're thinking about privilege, is the person that you're engaging in willing to sort of play by some of these rules, right? Are they willing to play by the rules of a new encounter and a new way of having a conversation? If someone's not willing to look at their power or to look at their privilege or even to look at the areas of marginalization, then it's a very different kind of a conversation to have, because actually you're having two separate conversations. Someone's saying, I don't want to see things differently. I'm not interested in learning how to bridge some of these gaps. And to me, that's very different than someone who says, I'm willing, I don't know how. Because then the person in the privileged position has the opportunity to go, oh, is that what you meant when you said have thick skin? Okay, you just pointed out something that is uncomfortable for me, but I'm willing to sit with the discomfort to learn something different, to learn something new. So even when you remind me, hey, you're kind of struggling with this, I know you're wanting to practice it. Could you practice it with somebody who's part of your affinity group first, so that when you come back to me with the information, this isn't the first time that you're negotiating some of this.
And there's a follow-up question. What are some invitation phrases?
Are you willing? Would you consider? What if? I think possibilities are some of the quick ways to think about this. I wonder if you were in a marginalized position and were trying to advocate for yourself, if you'd be thinking about all the fears that are in the way of you even beginning a conversation. Remember when you felt like, because here's one of the easiest ways, no matter how much privilege someone has, one of the earliest memories most people have of experiencing marginalization is our experience as kids, which is one of the reasons why we use phrases like, oh, you know, when I grow up, I'm gonna do what I want. No one's ever gonna make me do X, Y, and Z. We say things like, don't talk to me like a child, right? The reason why we say things like that is because we marginalize children. And so even if we remind ourselves or remind the person that we're speaking to that has more privilege, remember when you felt really powerless? Remember when you didn't have the ability to make an impact and how you felt? Are you willing to consider that that might be true for me right now in this conversation? Are you willing to consider doing something a little bit different so that we could actually have a more equitable conversation?
So I think that is an excellent place to pause and ask if anybody else has any other comments or questions. I did promise to keep this to an hour, but again, we're willing to go over if people have other thoughts.
How about from the other side? So when you have, you know, someone who is feeling marginalized and someone is asking those questions, will you consider, can you imagine? What are some of the tools that the person with power can use to recognize that they've said something or they're stepped in a place or that they did something that might have hurt the other person?
That's the place where I think I like the VCR method, because they should respond in the same way, to acknowledge, wow, I've had an impact on you. One that clearly was wounding and hurtful, to apologize and say, I'm willing to do it better. I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to consider. And not only am I going to practice doing it differently with you, I'm also going to seek out additional resources to inform me, because I don't want you to have the burden of me always practicing with you. So I think that there's a way to be humble and accountable at the same time, to kind of try to be as non-defensive as possible when something like that is pointed out. But to say, the onus is on me to change, the onus is on me to hear what you've said, to validate and recognize, you know, the risk that it took in order to share it, and say, yes, I'll take that information and do something with it.
I have a last question. So in these cases, like, and again, I'm not trying to undermine this advice, because I use actually some of this advice in, you know, in my work and with previous newsrooms that I've been in. But how do you ensure the empowerment of the person that's marginalized, you know, when they have to, in a sense, I guess, feel like they have to be the bigger person, or, you know, like, in a sense, manage up and try to I guess, in a sense, we're kind of like holding the privileged in this delicate space, and as we're wanting to get our messages across and what our needs are to change the situation at hand, we're also, in a sense, it's, you know, it's like a double-edged sword, because you feel that you want the empowerment, but you have to kind of come at it sometimes with like, all right, like, you know, let me just take this gently and let me kind of ease you in. And then a lot of the times, you know, you still get some kind of backlash, right? So how do you ensure that you feel, as a marginalized person, you still feel empowered, you still feel like you're not settling for something less when trying to confront someone of privilege in this situation?
I mean, that's a great question, and I don't think I have the complete answer for you, because one of the things that I don't have is the perfect way to ensure safety in those moments, right? Because it is a risk, and I think it's always a risk. But I do think it's different if you're in an environment that says these are shared values that we're willing to work on, right? That's one of the things that I think creates a little bit more room for these kinds of conversations, is if there's been a commitment. Has your newsroom made a commitment to say, hey, we're going to talk about social justice, we're going to practice this within ourselves, and this is an expectation in our work? Because then at least you have a position to stand on. versus if you start the conversation trying to convince the other person that this is of value. And so that's one of the places where I think there may be challenge, is if structurally there's no support in place in order to move these kinds of conversations forward, right? And so that might mean it needs to come, how does it get put into HR, right? How does it become a value that every new hire is told about, is talked about, and is prepared and trained for these kinds of things? So I think we need to have, structural shifts in order to support these kinds of dialogues. But I don't know of any place where it's perfect.
And
I just had an observation there. I mean, this might be a generational thing here, but if you wait for empowerment to be given to you, it is going to take a lifetime for it to come. and I have, from my personal experience, what I have learned is, and it's pushing through some of that uncomfortableness of speaking up in situations where you're still the low person on the totem pole, but making sure that your voice is heard in a sphere where you have the higher knowledge about a particular issue, community, whatever that might be. And I come from that kind of background, and perhaps it's because my newsrooms that I've worked in have been more supportive of that and welcomed that, but it's always been a constant educational thing that I have experienced, not talking down to people, but explaining to them where I'm coming from, or where my perspective is coming from, or why I know better in a particular situation versus the other. And maybe the leadership where I work has been more receptive of that, but waiting for that opportunity is not a strategy that works very well, I think. And as journalists, we certainly know that we need to be aggressive about things in our work environment, in the way we deal with our sources. So the timidity that I hear sometimes from people of a different generation, younger than me, is interesting to me. And I don't come from that, and perhaps personally, because of my own personality, perhaps I tend to challenge things more. But I hear more timidity from a younger generation of journalists than I do from people of my age group.
And like you said, part of that might also be the opportunity to practice it. And so practice it regardless of what the outcome is, let alone if you practice it and you've been received relatively well, and it encourages you to continue to push forward. But I also think, being really thoughtful around what's our expectation. When I speak up, am I speaking up because I'm expecting to change the other person? Or am I speaking up because this is what I believe and I'm valuing and honoring my voice, right? That this is important. And so even if you don't change, me not saying it would be a betrayal to myself. And so one of the things in my own experiences within my own organization, I've had to figure out, how do I negotiate some of those kinds of pieces where I'm not willing to participate in my own subjugation. That you're never going to convince me to do that. But that doesn't always mean that I speak up a lot, but that doesn't mean I speak to every single piece, because sometimes that's draining of my own energy. Right. And so trying to find, where are the spaces that are open, receptive, and welcoming, and where are the spaces in which I have to be strategic about how I go about things, right? And some of that is about putting together a base of support, which is, I think, is part of what, these kinds of conversations that you all are having today are so important around, right? How do you find a base of support to push and advocate for some of these changes that one person isn't doing it by themselves?
There's a little bit of that. Earlier you talked about the generational difference, where people of the baby boomer generation, they committed themselves to a job and stayed for decades. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there is a disconnect when they are confronted with people of a much younger generation who don't necessarily think they need to give decades before they achieve that level of trust. Mm-hmm. and get that privilege to be able to speak in those spaces. And there can be a disconnect of that, but if you're not pushing those boundaries, you're never gonna get in, because their work ethic and their view of how much loyalty and how much dedication and how much you have to invest before you're taken seriously is going to be very different than what you view as, you know, your dedication.
Right. But learning that and knowing that is helpful to the conversation, right? Because like you just said, you know, time in isn't the same thing as dedication. Time in isn't the same thing as trust. Time in isn't the same thing as, you know, having demonstrated your quality and your respectability and your ability to do the job, right? And so how are people defining those kinds of things is really helpful, as opposed to just, you know, you can sometimes assume everyone is coming from the same position, or assume that folks in a different generation, you know, people sometimes say millennials are slackers, right? You're always on your phone. They've never not had a phone, right? And so isn't it just as interesting to think about a baby boomer who's had to be really adaptive throughout their life because technology has continued to change? Don't you have strengths to offer that are equal to the folks who are millennials who've never not had it? It's different kind of strengths. Are there ways of honoring that?
And I think that I agree with you, Madhu, on, I'm sorry, am I pronouncing that correctly?
You are.
Okay, great. So I definitely agree with you on, you know, the advice on empowerment and how I'm first generation Nigerian, and I owe a lot of, you know, my being able to be vocal to my culture and just how, you know, my people are. But I think I'm a millennial, and you know, there are younger journalists than me, and I don't really see that many journalists who are younger than me that, you know, don't feel they can speak up. It's just they speak up, but they don't feel heard, and there's almost no middle ground to figuring out with an older generation of journalists, you know, how to communicate, how to speak that same language in a newsroom. I think that, you know, even myself, I feel a little bit privileged in feeling empowered already and feeling the need to want to speak up with purpose. And that's something that's not always taught. I think with higher education, in school, in people's families, it's not always taught. So one of the things that, you know, keep me being vocal is having people that advocate for me. And in newsrooms, you know, it's either you do have advocates who are your bosses, you know, some colleagues that are more seasoned than you, or you don't. And what do you do when you do not have those advocates? It's a little bit harder and it's more challenging to then get up to say, okay, now I have to seek out advocacy outside of my newsroom in order to cope and to continue my work at this newsroom. So it's complex, I think, especially with all generations, but especially with younger generations in maneuvering and finding their way and their voice in these spaces. And I feel like we have a responsibility, you know, whether it's Headline Club, whether it's, you know, O&A, whether it's, you know, people who have been in the industry for a long time, whether it's professors in higher ed, in J schools, we have a responsibility in teaching what, you know, traditionally people call soft skills, you know, empathy and communication and interaction with our colleagues. Those are still considered soft skills to this day. And those are the skills that actually propel me farther than some of the technical skills that I have. And I think, you know, just like you might do, like, I think, you know, we have the experience, we have the technical skill set, but people really don't value, you know, what does empathy look like in a two-way street? What does having a civil conversation about uncomfortable topics in the newsroom, in internal infrastructures, what does that look like? That's something that I don't think we've been good at as an industry, and that's something that we really need to focus on. And it's something that I wish that more conferences, I wish that more people who led a lot of these organizations that promote and have missions around things like this with our audience, not just like, not for internal infrastructures, but for newsroom audiences. We don't realize that we need to engage internally, and we need to fix our internal infrastructures in order for us to really positively impact what we do and how we communicate and how we build bridges with our audiences, with the communities that we are trying to tell stories about. So for me, there's a lot of disconnect, intergenerationally, racially, all of those aspects. There's a disconnect when it comes to these quote unquote soft skills that we need to actually hone in and are actually a part of being human and a part of being a journalist.
Yeah, I hear that. And it sounds like this has been an opportunity to name some of the things that are necessary and begin and continue things that you've already identified, right? To come together in various ways and say, how do we continue to practice this? What will this look like? How do we create spaces in the newsroom for this to become a more normal conversation, a more typical conversation, that there's room for this because we value it and know it's important.
You're on mute, Rob. You're still okay.
I lost my mouse. I wanted to ask a question that to give people strategies when they're talking to people who did not go through this training. And I'm talking about both ends of the spectrum here, people in power and people without power. How do you have this kind of conversation with someone who is either unwilling to or are so entrenched in their point of view that it's hard to have a collaborative conversation that moves it forward?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I invite people to consider, right, is, do you actually want to have a dialogue? Do you want to have a conversation, or are you trying to convince me that you're right? I'm not sure. And so sometimes slowing down that part of the process is really helpful and allow someone to actually think a little bit about what is the outcome. One of the things that I think is difficult when you've got someone who might be beginning the process from an adversarial point of view is pointing out that's how you're experiencing them. But it does require you to be more vulnerable and you to put in some work on the front end, because the other person may not fully realize and they may not have bought in to the idea of doing it differently. And so I think saying, I want to have a different kind of a conversation, I'm experiencing you as really defensive and I'm struggling to be able to hear and to hold what you have to say. I'm wondering, do you just want to be right, or do you actually want to talk about this? That's one of the things that I ask people, right? Because I'm not really interested in right fighting.
So we are almost to 90 minutes, and I only tell everybody that because that's exactly how long I scheduled. So I don't want to get kicked off and we just get cut off. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to thank Cadmona for her time and being our trainer and our facilitator. Also, Cadmona, if people wanted to reach out to you or have training for their own newsrooms or their own organizations, how can they reach you?
The easiest way to reach me is my email, which is my name, Cadmona A Hall @gmail. Because I have such a unique name, I got it. 2 emails, either just Cadmona@gmail or Cadmona A Hall. And actually, I would be happy to come in and actually do something a little bit more in depth to slow this down so that we actually have more time to really have an increased conversation. I know tonight was supposed to be, just the beginning parts of the process, but I really appreciate and respect the fact that this is important to you all and that you all want to be people who push this forward. And I think that's amazing, because here's the thing, you all are a unique field that does so much good for the public. I can't imagine where we would be without journalists. And so
one of the things I was hoping to say as a follow-up, we might consider, the art of negotiating in environments that are multi-generational and perhaps multiracial, or with
Yeah.
so many different, that's one of the things that we don't learn, not just as journalists. I don't think people generally learn that, how to navigate an environment that is diverse. And diversity is not just of our color, but definitely the age, sex, all the different factors, background, social status, all of those things matter. So the art of negotiation and the art of, like water cooler diplomacy type of thing, something, because the commonalities, finding the commonalities when you're generationally so far apart, it's a bit of a challenge, and you have to work at it. You have to find those things that you can actually be, you can have a conversation about. Like, everyone can agree on Seinfeld, but not everybody has the same life experiences.
Yeah, I mean, like any muscle, it has to be exercised and it has to be utilized, otherwise it will atrophy.
So Madhu, I think what did you say? Water cooler diplomacy? That is the title of the next program that I expect you to.
Coined it right now.
That's great. I am so afraid that we're all just going to get shut down. The Zoom is just going to kick us out. So Cadmona, thank you again. And this will be up hopefully sometime tomorrow. And again, I hope this is not the end of the conversation. For those of you who did not, or could not attend, you can find Cadmona just through Google, Cadmona A Hall. And again, I am Robert K. Elder. I am the president of the Chicago Headline Club and the chief digital officer for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Thank you so much, everyone, for spending this time with us. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Doctor. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Robert.